Great. Well, hello and welcome to the Orlando Museum of Art's Art Sandwiched In. I am David Madison, the Associate Curator of Education and Outreach at OMA. Now, before we begin today, I'd like us just to go over a few of the features of our Zoom classroom. The participant chat is the best place to share comments quickly with the group. We love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've seen the new exhibition, the Cathedrals of Florida Masterworks by Clyde Butcher, which is inspiring today's program. And to access the Q&A, which is where you should ask questions for our speaker, that's at the bottom of your toolbar. It says Q&A. Go ahead and post anything you want us to address in the discussion portion of today's program there. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this afternoon. Eve Samples is the executive director of Friends of the Everglades, a nonprofit founded in 1969 by Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Prior to joining Friends of the Everglades, Eve worked as opinion editor for USA Today, Network Florida, as a columnist and editor for TC Palm and Treasure Coast newspapers, and as a reporter for the Palm Beach Post and Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She is a native of Miami and a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So please help me welcome our speaker, Eve Samples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Yep, if you want to go ahead, do you want to try sharing your screen?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And as I do, I just want to say that I'm delighted that the Orlando Museum of Art is focusing on environmental issues because I really believe in the power of art to elevate awareness and activate advocacy on the environmental front. So that's a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And can you see my screen okay, David?
I can, and I also love your virtual background. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that too.
Absolutely. So I'm based out of Stuart, Florida, and we were lucky enough to have an exhibit of Clyde Butcher's Everglades photography in Stuart earlier this year. And we hosted an author chat with him, which I participated in. So this is a picture of the Martin County Cultural Courthouse, which hosted that exhibit. So Wonderful. It felt like the appropriate virtual background to have today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Eve.
Absolutely. So I can jump in and get started, David, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We were founded in 1969 by Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Friends of the Everglades. And I'm sure many of you know that name. If you're attending today, you probably know her long history as an environmental activist in Florida. Many folks learned her name after the shooting in Parkland at the high school that bears her name there. So there's increasing awareness about who Marjory was, and I'm delighted to tie her legacy into our current work today. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and restore the only Everglades in the world, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're dedicated to advocacy and education, which is very in keeping with Marjory's legacy. This is our fearless founder. And a year and a half ago, I left journalism. As David described, I was a journalist for 20 years and fell into the footsteps of this woman. She was only 5'2", but she has immense shoes to fill. She wrote the book River of Grass in 1947 and helped redefine the world's view of the Everglades ecosystem, helping people realize that it wasn't a swamp to be conquered, but it was a really vital resource for Florida, the people of Florida, wildlife of Florida, and essential to the future of Florida. And then she became an activist for the Everglades in 1969 when she founded our organization. She was really focused on writing more prior to that. So I think now she's arguably Florida's greatest environmental folk hero. There are probably some other good contenders for that. This is the Everglades River of Grass, her book that really most people identify Marjory with. And the text I have on the screen here are the opening lines of the book, which are just incredibly poetic. So I'm going to read them out loud. She started with, "There are no other Everglades in the world. They always have been one of the unique regions of the earth, remote, never wholly known. And if anyone listening hasn't read The Everglades River of Grass, it's really holds up well and stands the test of time. And so much of her prose is poetic in this manner, and it really calls to mind for me Clyde Butcher's photography, that remoteness, that mystery, and Clyde's methods of literally immersing himself in the swamp really seem to capture something about this ecosystem that is not always attainable or understandable from afar. So the Everglades are remote and mysterious, and they are also in peril. And that's a lot of what we spend our time thinking about at Friends of the Everglades. The Everglades aren't just that southern end of the system. You see here Everglades National Park down at the southern end. I think a lot of non-Floridians just think of those images when they think of the Everglades. But as many of you on this webinar probably know, it's actually a vast ecosystem that stretches about 18,000 square miles, and about half of the historic water flow has been diverted. And this is relevant for our audience today. The historic headwaters are in the Orlando area at Shingle Creek. This map here is actually a list of trailheads. It's evergladestrail.org is a site you can go to find different trails to explore the Greater Everglades. And of course, a couple of them are up near Orlando and Kissimmee. The Everglades is home to more than 2,000 species of plants and animals, including the endangered Florida panther. Only about 200, arguably fewer than that, Florida panthers remain. It's just one of the many species we think about when we think about Everglades restoration. And we also are thinking increasingly about human beings as a species, because so many of the challenges that face the Everglades in terms of water quality are also problematic in terms of human health, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. So I mentioned that Marjory Stoneman Douglas founded Friends of the Everglades in 1969, and she decided to found a group in her 70s. I mean, she was not a young woman by then, because she wanted to fight what was to be known as the Everglades Jetport. It was going to be a massive airport in the middle of what's now Big Cypress National Preserve, north of Everglades National Park. And this was billed as progress and really business development. And Marjory called it like she saw it. She thought it was a terrible idea. She founded Friends of the Everglades to fight it. And luckily, we, with help from many friends, won that battle. But as you can see here, there's a New York Times headline from 1970 about the Everglades Jetport being barred. But you see here that a runway was built before construction was halted. And it really stands as a sort of monument to Florida's follies, in my view. You can see here from this Google Earth image, which is recent, the wetlands that surround it, and you can envision the danger that would have occurred if that entire massive jetport would have been built. So victories are hard won in Everglades protection, and I think about this image often. The challenges today look a little different, not entirely different, because often the same problems reemerge. But this is one of the things we're fighting today, toxic algae blooms. And I'll spend the bulk of our time together today talking about them, what we're doing to combat them, and what you all can do to get involved. So Florida has a multi-front water crisis. Lake Okeechobee, the liquid heart of Florida, is perpetually afflicted by toxic algae blooms, primarily cyanotoxins, which is blue-green algae. And Lake Okeechobee was artificially connected to the Caloosahatchee Estuary to the west and the St. Lucie Estuary to the east. And unfortunately, both of those connections are now relief valves for the lake when it gets too high, and those toxic algae blooms move through those estuaries, rivers. And then to the south, the historic River of Grass in the Everglades, Everglades National Park and Florida Bay don't get enough water. So this illustrates, to oversimplify, the heart of that problem. So on the left here, you see the historic flow of water, the wide river of grass that slowly meandered from Lake Okeechobee before human beings intervened and drained much of this area. And up north in the Kissimmee River Valley, the oxbows slowly flowed into the lake. Well, as I mentioned, to the east, the St. Lucie was artificially connected, and to the west, the Caloosahatchee, and that ended up cutting off a large amount of water that should have gone south. So we're hoping to restore those flows, and I'm going to talk today about how that's possible. A lot of what we talk about is bad news in Everglades restoration, but I do want to highlight some good news that actually was just completed this year. This is an older photo, but Kissimmee River restoration is a success we can point to in the world of Everglades advocacy. It took 22 years to restore 40 miles of winding oxbows to the Kissimmee River. Unfortunately, starting in 1948, Congress authorized channelization of the river. So you can see on the left here, this is the old channel, and these are the restored winding oxbows. So what man does, he can undo, and he undid it here. Of course, the hope for the future is that we don't create so many problems to begin with. So north of the lake, a great success story. South of the lake, we still have a lot of challenges. On the left, this is the historic image of the Everglades. There were sawgrass plains south of Lake Okeechobee, a ridge and slough system where water meandered down eventually to Florida Bay. Well, the Everglades agricultural area was created starting in the 1948 through the Central and South Florida Plan, and water was drained from the system. These water conservation areas were created, and we're still grappling with those effects today. And of course, all this development sprung up along the coast in South Florida, Miami-Dade County, Broward, Palm Beach. So keeping those developed areas dry has also contributed to our challenges. And as a result, this keeps happening. This is actually from the west coast of Florida in 2018, and really alarming to see people recreate in these toxic blue-green algae blooms that relate to the replumbing of the system. The reason this keeps happening is twofold. First, water management decisions, meaning when, where, and how much water is moved through this artificially plumbed system. The way it's set up now really favors large industrial farms over human health and ecosystems. And that Everglades agricultural area that I showed a map of is primarily sugarcane, primarily held by two very large sugar companies, US Sugar and Florida Crystals. And their drainage and irrigation gets priority when it comes to Lake Okeechobee water. And I see I have two number ones here. We'll call them tied. Pollution regulations in Florida lack teeth. That's the second reason that we are seeing this problem happen over and over again. So to talk about the first problem, water management, Lake Okeechobee is held artificially high in the dry months. So back before the Everglades agricultural area was created, water was allowed to flow south naturally when the lake got too high. Well, now that water is discharged to the east and west when the lake gets high. And then instead of letting the lake recede to the maximum natural extent in the dry months, the lake retains water so that sugarcane fields can be irrigated during the dry months. And why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic because when we get to June 1st and hurricane season rolls around and the lake is higher than it needs to be, that's when we enter the summer months and end up getting releases east and west. There are two, and I can kind of point at them here, connections, gates from Lake Okeechobee. The S308 gate goes east, and to the west, mainly the S79 gate is what we think about. And this is the results we get. It's an increasing problem. Blue-green algae isn't just an issue in Florida. I'm sure many of you have seen reports of it in Lake Erie and elsewhere in the United States and around the world. But we've really seen it amplified in recent years in Florida. It was especially visible in 2018. Many of you might remember images of dead wildlife in Southwest Florida. And Stewart, where I sit today, also has been afflicted repeatedly over the years. So that's our water management part of the problem. And I also mentioned pollution regulations and a lack of teeth, a lack of enforcement. So we know that the largest sources of pollution are from agricultural lands into Lake Okeechobee. That's no secret. And the problem is we regulate pollution in Florida through what are known as best management practices. And I have best in quotes here because they're not working best for the ecosystems. There's a presumption of compliance for landowners who enroll in these best management practices. And it relates to things like how much fertilizer is applied to land. And unfortunately, those best management practices are not hitting the pollution limits for the basins that are really impaired, including the Lake Okeechobee Basin. So this is what we get. This is satellite imagery from NOAA, which passes over Lake Okeechobee every single day. And it's a tool that's actually been really helpful to detecting algae blooms on the lake. And this was a snapshot from satellite imagery in 2018, when NOAA reported 90% of Lake Okeechobee's open water showed signs of toxic blue-green algae. So you can imagine when those gates open to the east and to the west, how that algae moves through and then ends up on the populated communities of Stewart and Southwest Florida, Fort Myers area. And that indeed happened. So toxins in 2018, just to use kind of a case study year from recent history, were released to the Caloosahatchee. Red tide blooms in the Gulf that year compounded the problem. So red tide blooms are naturally occurring, but I've heard a great analogy about red tide. It's kind of like a stray animal. If you keep feeding it, it sticks around. So when you feed red tide with these nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen that are in Lake Okeechobee releases, it compounds the problem. So we had really an unprecedented situation in 2018, where at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, where it enters the Gulf, you had blue-green algae toxins, cyanotoxins, mingling with red tide toxins. And we don't even really know the impact of those toxins mingling, but we know that both are very bad for human health and individually. And I know this is a lunchtime program, so I apologize for this image, but I actually cut some of the really gruesome ones out. It's important to remember that the marine life that died in 2018 was by the ton. Lee County had its biggest beach cleanup in history. There were waste facilities used to bring dead marine life that was cleared from beaches with construction equipment, as you see here. So it was devastating, and it's important to remember these images because we haven't seen something of this scale since 2018, thankfully not in Southwest Florida. Of course, Tampa Bay has been struggling, but the causes of these problems haven't gone away. We've just been pretty lucky in recent years. That same year, 2018, the St. Lucie River saw much of the same. Sadly, on the St. Lucie side, a dog died as a result of a blue-green algae exposure that was confirmed through a necropsy. It was playing in the water. And FAU, Florida Atlantic University, did a study of nasal passages, swabs, and found that 95% of study participants had cyanotoxins in their nose that year. So this is serious stuff, and we're learning more and more about the health problems it can cause. This is an image of a couple of news stories from that year in 2018. I mentioned the dog that was afflicted, and there was an office building, Florida Sportsman, it's a magazine. Its offices were on the water on the St. Lucie Canal. And you see here on the left, the publisher of Florida Sportsman standing near that green canal. And he actually closed their offices because the smell, it smells kind of like ammonia when you're near these really concentrated blooms. The smell was so noxious in their offices along that canal that he didn't feel comfortable letting his staff work there. I was a journalist at the time in 2018, and this is one of my former coworkers. She's a photographer with the Treasure Coast newspapers, and she actually actually donned this heavy duty mask when she went out to photograph this stuff just to keep herself safe. And of course, we're all much more used to mask wearing in the world these days. But then it was certainly out of the norm, but something that we journalists felt necessary to protect ourselves. And this is an important point. One more point I want to make about the health impacts. So we've known for quite some time that liver disease can be related to toxic blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, but there is emerging research indicating that it can also cause neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. So scary stuff here. And if anyone wants to know more about that, I really recommend the documentary Toxic Puzzle. It's on Amazon Prime. It's narrated by Harrison Ford. We don't have any official affiliation with it, but it's really an eye-opening look at what these blue-green algae toxins can do to humans. And it explores the hunt for a solution, a therapy to prevent people from declining if they have been exposed. So I've spent most of my time now talking about blue-green algae and the problems we face there. I want to just explain a little bit more about red tide. So I mentioned they start naturally. They can be fed by man-made pollutants. They are amplified by man-made pollutants, and they tend to start 10 to 40 miles offshore. And this is an image of red tide from past years in Florida. And of course, anyone who paid attention to the news this year knows that the Piney Point disaster contributed to red tide bloom in the Tampa Bay area this year. Again, that red tide was already a problem, but there's pretty clear evidence that the Piney Point disaster, the discharges into Tampa Bay, accelerated the problem. This used to be a controversial stance. In fact, if you went to the state's Department of Environmental Protection website years ago, maybe 5 years ago, you wouldn't see any indication that man-made pollution plays a role in red tide. Well, now you have very respectable institutions like the Smithsonian acknowledging that. So this is becoming the scientific consensus. So let's get back to the solutions. I just spent a lot of time talking about the problems, which can feel very daunting and scary, especially when we recognize that these algae blooms are fed by warmer temperatures, and we know that the temperatures are rising across the planet. So how do we fix this? There are solutions, and it's important to keep those in sight. Well, it gets back to Marjory's river of grass. We need to send more water south from Lake Okeechobee. And that's because the Everglades needs the water, and Florida Bay, south of the Everglades and the Keys, also needs fresh water because it can become hypersaline. So Marjory had it right when she called the Everglades a river of grass, and it's really what we need to keep in sight as we think about restoration. So specifically, there are 3 prongs to this solution. Number one, infrastructure. These are these big earth-moving projects like the Kissimmee River restoration. They're expensive. They take many, many years to complete. We've had some success like in the Kissimmee, but we also need to continue, and we need to use the infrastructure that we do create for the benefit of Florida's waters, Floridians, not polluters. And south of the lake, there are about 60,000 acres of stormwater treatment areas. That's man-made marshes that are designed to clean phosphorus from the water, clean nutrient from the water moving south. And most of those, the capacity in those stormwater treatment areas are used to clean sugarcane runoff, not Lake Okeechobee water that needs to move south. So there's a discrepancy there, especially since taxpayers have paid for most of those, but sugarcane farmers get most of the benefits. So that's something we work on. Number 2, operations. So manage Lake Okeechobee to protect human health. And we have a great opportunity for that right now because the Army Corps of Engineers is working on a new plan for the lake that will guide when, where, and how much water moves from the lake for the next decade. It's called LOSM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. It's something that we at Friends of the Everglades have been very involved with for a couple of years now, and the new plan will take effect next year. And finally, water quality, enforceable pollution limits. We need them in Florida. Unfortunately, there's not been the political will to crack down and do what needs to be done, but we'll continue to push for that. And there's a sign of hope. Last year, there was a lawsuit related to discharges from Lake Okeechobee, east and west, and there was an encouraging ruling that said the Army Corps of Engineers needs to think more about the impacts on endangered species when discharging. So this was a glimmer of hope. It's not the whole solution, but we try to hold on to those glimmers. And I have just a few more slides here, and I'm really curious to hear if the audience has questions. I know that one of the questions we often get relates to Governor DeSantis. So this is a very concise view of what the governor's been doing. If you recall, he was running for office in 2018 when that horrible toxic algae crisis occurred. So this became a really visible issue on the campaign trail. And his first week in office in 2019, he did roll out an executive order. He cleaned house on the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board, which is the state agency responsible for moving water in and around the lake. And that was a good thing, and better members of the governing board were put into place. And he also created a blue-green algae task force and revived Red Tide Task Force, which used to have a different name. So those are the good things. You see, I have them in green here. A needs work category is that many of the recommendations of those task forces, especially the blue-green algae task force, have not been implemented adequately. Some of them have been, but not enough. So we advocate for that. The blue-green algae task force issued in late 2019 a series of really good recommendations. These are smart, unbiased scientists that are just calling for solutions. And we just need more of those to be enacted. And then in the not so good category for DeSantis, he did sign 2 polluter-friendly bills in 2021, the right to farm expansion, which gave sugarcane growers protection from the harmful impacts of sugarcane burning, which causes air quality problems, especially in the Glades communities south of Lake Okeechobee, which don't get the same protections from burning as wealthier coastal communities. And then there was a seaport preemption bill that we were really concerned about. Key West voters voted to limit cruise ship sizes through local referendums, and the state legislature preempted them and removed their right to do that. So we opposed that as well. So, those are the pros and cons of what we see the governor doing, and we'll continue to track it. State legislative session is starting early this time around in January, so there's always work to be done watchdogging that. That's DeSantis and what he's doing. What would Marjory do? Well, if she taught us anything, I think it's that one person can really make a difference on these issues. She was writing columns about these issues in the Miami Herald back before it was widely understood. She was spotlighting social justice issues as well and brought attention to them. And of course, with her book, River of Grass, really changed the narrative on the Everglades. So I think she would applaud Orlando voters who in 2020 overwhelmingly approved a rights of nature bill last year. I know that's another thing that the legislature preempted. So that's the constant battle, the local home rule thing. But I think Marjorie would certainly be proud of that. And I'll just end with my very favorite quote from Marjorie, and I'll read it aloud here. She said, "Be a nuisance where it counts. Do your part to inform and stimulate the public to join your action. Be depressed, discouraged, and disappointed at failure and the disheartening effects of ignorance, greed, corruption, and bad politics, but never give up." So that's a bit of a mantra for us at Friends of the Everglades, and we're very proud of that legacy. She didn't pull any punches, and we continue to walk in her shoes. So I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eve. That was wonderful. I have questions, and then we actually have one question already from an audience member, from Lee Bruno. She's asking, have you discussed so beautifully the water quality in South Florida. What about the state of plant life, which Butcher photographs so beautifully? For example, the grasses and the mangroves.
Mhm. You know, a major crisis in the Greater Everglades right now is the collapse of seagrass. In the Indian River Lagoon region, we've seen a massive die-off, especially in the Northern Lagoon. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the manatee mortalities this year. It's been what is officially known as an unusual mortality event. So that has resulted in an immense, an immense loss of seagrass has resulted in manatees starving, sadly. So these problems are directly connected to water quality. Phosphorus and nitrogen loading in the water kill seagrass. So does sediment loading, because when the water gets too opaque, so the seagrass can't get the sunlight it needs to grow. So yeah, there are really serious problems related to vegetation too. So great question.
And I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more on your background as a journalist, and you did it today, but storytelling, it seems to be such an important part of environmental work. I'm wondering who you work with in terms of storytellers, artists. I know Clyde, you've worked with Clyde, but what are those? Who are the people we should be maybe listening to and looking to?
Yeah, I love that question. Houston Cypress, Reverend Houston Cypress, is a leader with the Miccosukee tribe, and he has a group called Love the Everglades. And he's done some incredibly poetic video artwork, performance art related to the Everglades. And he's a poet in his own right, too. So we really love Houston's eloquence and his commitment to the cause. Um, there are some local artists, and back when I was a journalist, a working journalist, there was a woman named Janine Mason, who's an artist, who created something called the Solidarity Fish. And in the Stewart area, she created some, and then she had the community get involved. They were wooden cutout fish, and on one side they were painted vibrant, beautiful colors, and on the other side it was black and white fish bones, like a dead fish. And so they were brought around town to rallies and really became a symbol of both the crisis and the hope, the two sides of the fish. So I've always been a fan of Janine's work. And gosh, there are so many we could mention, but those two come to mind, first of all.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's David Milton actually asked a very similar question when I was sharing it, but the role of art in your advocacy and beautiful images versus sad images. And, I actually think that gets into another point. So this is, you've been in this role for a few years? Or
a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's very difficult. It's very challenging. The images that you're looking at, the state of the Everglades, the state of this environmental crisis, and maybe you touched upon it with the Kissimmee River and the rerouting, but where is the hope in the work you do, and how does that personally just out, but for your organization overall, how do you keep going with this work when there's so much that can be discouraging?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And these problems reemerge. So I mentioned that we were founded to stop a big jet port, the Everglades jet port. Well, 20 years ago, there was a proposal to convert Homestead Air Force Base in South Miami-Dade County to a commercial airport, and we helped successfully fight that too. Well, fast forward to this year, and that same proposal has reemerged, even though there was a record of decision from the Air Force 20 years ago that we believe just clearly states the case for not allowing a commercial airport between Everglades National Park and Biscayne National Park, because this property is right between the two. So here we are again, fighting the same battle. And I guess I have the benefit of just being on this side of the fence for a year and a half. So I still feel pretty inspired and motivated. And some of our board members at Friends of the Everglades were engaged in that battle 20 years ago. And it is challenging for them to stay at it. But I think they just have a deep commitment to the cause and the big picture view that Florida's population is growing increasingly rapidly. We have fewer and fewer wild spaces, green spaces left, and we really need to preserve every last bit of it, within reason. because we're going to reach a tipping point someday. So a lot of this work feels defensive and avoiding that tipping point. And we haven't even talked about climate change, which is of course a parallel concern. So yeah, that's how we stay out. I think we know how much worse the situation would be if we weren't out there making these points.
I think that's the beauty of Clyde's work. I mean, it's also kind of dismal, I guess, but sometimes when I look at his work, it's so beautiful. And at the same time, I'm asking myself, what will this look like in 10 years? What does this look like now? In certain cases, have these environments already been lost? And that can be a challenging feeling to wrestle with in the galleries, to wrestle with Clyde's work. But it's also kind of the beautiful impetus for doing a show like this. And so we do have a couple other questions, and one of them is
Can I jump in, David, with one quick
please.
thing about Clyde's work? So if any of you have the opportunity to go to his gallery in Big Cypress, you can do a swamp walk there. And I did this with my staff last year. And you go with a guide behind the gallery in the middle of Big Cypress, and the water conditions were pretty high when we were there. So I'm not very tall. I'm 5'3", and I was up to my waist in this cypress swamp. And it sounds alarming, and you worry about snakes and alligators, but it was really a mystical experience to be submerged in the Everglades like that. And in fact, my shoes, you wear shoes when you go in, like sneakers, they came out cleaner than I went in with them, because that water, it's dark, it's tannin stained, but it's clear. And there's a limestone bottom that you're actually walking on. So incredible experience if anyone's in Big Cypress, and you can book a reservation to do a swamp walk behind Clyde's gallery there.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, very transformative. So we had one question actually related to climate change, since you touched upon it. What is the outlook for the Everglades in light of the expected sea level rise over the next few decades?
Yeah, so this is a challenge, right? We're investing billions of dollars into Everglades restoration projects like the Kissimmee River, and there are projects in the south of the system that are equally expensive. But if we're going to lose the Everglades to sea level rise, that can feel futile. Fortunately, there's a very good reason to restore the flow of water south from Lake Okeechobee, clean water south from Lake Okeechobee, that can help combat some of the saltwater intrusion that relates to sea level rise. So if you do restore the southern flow through the cleansing marshes, the stormwater treatment areas, and down to Everglades National Park, you can push back some of that saltwater intrusion, you can replenish the aquifer. So to us, climate change and sea level rise are yet another reason for urgency on Everglades restoration and preservation of the remaining lands we have left.
And then one last question from Dennis. Is there any hope for mitigating the political power of Big Sugar in South Florida?
I love that question. It's something we think about a lot. And I think it's fair to ask the question, and this is not a partisan issue, because sugar gives prolifically to both parties, both political parties. Famously, one of the Fanhole brothers supports Democrats, the other supports Republicans. So I think we need to ask ourselves the question, can our elected officials truly be objective on water policy when they're taking significant money from this industry that has a very vested interest in managing water a certain way and maintaining the status quo? So clearly, I think the answer is no, that objectivity is almost impossible if you're taking large sums. So I am hopeful, and I think an increasing number of people are recognizing that our water management is out of whack in Florida. And as painful and scary as the 2018 toxic algae crisis was, it really showed us that it made the problem visible, and it created urgency too. So more people researched it, got involved, understood the role of the sugar industry. So yeah, this is an industry that gets federal support from the government, supported at many layers of the law, and people are beginning to see how that's impacting us. So I remain hopeful.
And with that, maybe you could share just a call to action. What should we be doing here in terms of how we can get involved with your organization or just with Everglades environmental action?
Sure. So one very easy way is you can sign up for our newsletter. We really try to break down these complicated issues for the layman. We have an email that goes out once a month called Everglades Illustrated that just in a snapshot explains a problem to you. Our most recent one was about sugarcane burning, and it mapped the smoke impacts. We also have action alerts when there's a bad bill in Tallahassee that could impact the Greater Everglades or water quality in general. We'll try to make it easy for you to let your representative know that you're not in favor of this. So that's an easy way. And again, I just commend Orange County voters for the rights of nature action. That's something to track in this upcoming session. State Representative Anna Escamani has filed a bill to repeal that preemption. In other words, to let local governments support or pass rights of nature ordinances. So we're in favor of that. And in the Orlando area, that's a great thing to pay attention to. And well, one last thing, David, just get out there and enjoy it. I mean, we're entering the most beautiful part of the year in Florida, and there's nothing like getting on a kayak or hiking through some wilderness to just reaffirm your connection to nature.
Absolutely. And I think Clyde Butcher's work actually does that for us too.
Absolutely. Go to the Orlando Museum. Yeah.
Please, yes, please come and see the exhibition. It is currently on view, Cathedrals of Florida Masterworks by Clyde Butcher. Well, thank you so much, Eve. It has been just wonderful to hear from you, learn from you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.